Thank you for having me. So the thing is, I don't have much trouble saying no to something that I don't think I'll enjoy. Some people have that trouble. Thankfully, I don't. At least I think I am. But I do have a lot of trouble saying no to something that seems awesome. And that's why I've had a list of personal to-do things besides my laptop since December of 2014, when I first discovered my passion for the visualization of data. I do cross things off every now and then, but new items appear just as fast. But in hindsight, I don't mind this permanent lack of having enough free time left to actually get bored. I feel that my personal projects have given me opportunities that I didn't even know I was looking for. And they also played a really big role in me being able to pursue a freelance career now 3 years later. And my favorite personal project is the one I want to share with you today. It was a year-long collaboration that I did with Shirley, who is, like me, a data visualization freelancer, although she's based in San Francisco and I'm from Amsterdam. So to set the scene, a bit of background. Shirley and me first met virtually in a DataVis Slack channel before meeting in real life a few months later at Conf, where we both had the honor to speak. And we really hit it off during those 3 days. And a few weeks later, I was publishing tutorials about the different aspects of my talk, and Shirley really jumped on them and started asking me all kinds of questions. And somewhere during those chats, we started lamenting the fact that we hadn't created that many more advanced data visualizations in the last year as we wanted to. We'd been focusing a lot on tutorials and blog posts and other stuff. And so suddenly, Shirley asked me out of the blue, well, then do you want to collaborate and create stuff? And I think it took me mere seconds to reply with an all-capital yes, and that's how Data Sketches was born. So in the following week, we figured out that we both liked the idea where we would create a visualization each month around a specific topic, and do that for a year, to see how 2 people would create 2 visualizations, starting from the same seed, that topic, and then diverging into different paths based on our own interests and history. And besides sharing the end result, we also want to write about the creation process. And we split this up into the 3 pillars that we find most important: data, sketching, and coding. And at first, we thought we could pull data sketches off with about 5 to 6 hours a week. But as usual, real life really doesn't care about plans, especially coding plans, I find. So since starting in July of 2016, we've clocked many, many hours into creating our visualizations each month. And during this talk, I'd like to take you through some of the lessons that I learned, challenges faced, and insights that I gathered along the way. So to start off with the most fundamental aspect of data visualization, the data itself. So a lot of people come to us, they ask us, hey, where did you find the data? How did you find your data? But it's typically not the data that guides us. It's the topic of each month that first provides a spark of an idea, an insight that we might want to reveal, and then how we could visualize that. And only after we have this more concrete angle do we investigate to see if there's some appropriate data available. For example, the topic of November was books. Pretty broad, I'd say. But I really wanted to focus on fantasy books, or even more specifically, the themes and titles of fantasy books. And when I have that more concrete angle, I do nothing more special than just Google the web, using my more concrete angle together with the words data or dataset, and then having the patience to investigate each link on the first 2 or 3 pages of results. And this has led me to Google spreadsheets containing thousands of Olympic medal winners, and GitHub repos with wonderfully unique datasets, such as one about the words spoken in the Lord of the Rings. I'll get back to that later. Or a family tree of 3,000 people connected to royalty going back more than a millennia. I've also learned that website design says nothing about the quality of the data it shares. So there are also websites that contain structured information, but not in some ready-to-download format. Instead, I have to scrape the logical layout of the website and put the information that it contains into a file myself with the help of some code. IMDb, for example, has this advanced search that returns a list of movies. And each of these movies is contained within the same set of divs and other elements. I can therefore download the HTML and use a script to search for all of the stylings that follow a specific rule. All of the movie titles could be contained within a div or h1 of class title. And another example is that on Amazon, I found a list of the top 100 best-selling fantasy authors that I could use. So there are also APIs from which you can request information, but I have to admit, I don't often use these because they can be a bit of a hassle to set up for a one-time use. However, sometimes the wealth of information is just too good to ignore. So using those 100 author names that I scraped from Amazon, I then used the Goodreads API to request information about the top 10 most rated books of each author, gathering info on the number of ratings, the average rating, and of course the titles of these books. Well, another good strategy for finding data can just be to ask others for advice. For April, our topic was community, and I knew I really wanted to do something about Earth, something that would sort of fit the World Wildlife Fund. But I couldn't get my angle any more concrete than that, so I asked Twitter for advice. And I got a dozen or so interesting links that I started browsing, which led me to new links, and so on, until I finally came upon this page that showed me an image of the amount of greenness as measured from space on a specific day in June. And when I saw this, I knew I'd found my hook. I wanted to visualize the same information, animate it smoothly throughout the year, and try my own spin on the visual styling. Eventually, that turned into this. And although it was actually technically quite complex because a lot of data, the visual itself is very minimalistic. I mean, it's I think a simple title and legend are all that is needed for most to understand what they're looking at. And finally, you can find data completely manually, no code required. For our Nostalgia Month, I went into Dragon Ball Z. I'll get back to this visual later as well. But on the Dragon Ball wiki pages, I found these lists of all of the fights that happened during this anime. And I just copy and pasted these lists into Excel, and with the help of some of Excel's functions, split that apart into the different characters and other information. And it took me about 2 hours to get the data ready for these 200 fights, which I still think is less time than if I tried to write a scraper that would handle all of the nuances that were in these texts. Or when I actually spent 2 hours trying to find a proper data set on the characteristics of butterflies, and have to resign myself that the best option seems to be contained within a website called Gardens with Wings. Too bad. But again, I felt that creating a scraper to go through this sort of semi-structured website would take more time than the manual approach. So I just clicked through all of the options and copy-pasted the information that I needed into a final data set of 87 different butterfly species. So what I hope to have shown you with all of these examples is that there's not just one specific way to find data. It's not just hardcore data analysts that have these magical skills. No, data can be found in so many different ways, from Googling and finding a straightforward CSV or Excel file, to scraping a website or even doing it manually. But be aware that for visualization, you often have to do some final data adjustments or preparations to make it sure that it fits the visualization that you're going to use. And to dive a little bit more then into what those kinds of preparations could be, for August 2016, the obvious theme was the Olympics, especially since Shirley and me were both big fans. And I ended up visualizing all 5,000 gold medal winners since the very first games in 1896. So each of these circles here is a group of similar sports. We have water sports over here and ball sports over here. And then within that, each of these sort of slices or feathers is a specific sport. So we have athletics. I was pointing at my screen, that's so useless. And then from the first edition all the way outward to 2016. On the reddish background, we have the female events. And on the bluish background, we have the male events. And then finally, each medal itself is given the color of the continent in which the country lies that won. So Europe is blue, the Americas is red, Africa is black, and so on. And you can sort of get a feeling of trends going on, or for example, there was something here with a block that Russia didn't show up, so somebody else won all the artistic ones. Or what I find really interesting is that tug of war was an actual Olympic sport during the very first editions. I mean, can you imagine that today? Just this group of men and women just pulling on the rope. It's kind of funny. And I found the data for this piece in 2 articles published by The Guardian for the 2012 Games in London. But after getting a rough shape of the visual on my screen, I noticed that some very obvious metals were missing from 2012, like hockey. So suddenly, my confidence in this dataset dropped drastically, even coming from such a respectable source. I therefore had to get a sense of the overall accuracy before I could continue. But I didn't want to have to manually inspect or investigate all of these 5,000 metals, so I found a proxy instead. On Wikipedia, I could find lists that contained the number of events that occurred during each edition, which I then compared to the number of gold medals I had in my dataset. And if there was a discrepancy, I investigated further to figure out where and why. And that's how I found out that for some of the editions, the horses were also in the dataset, which makes for quite an interesting read to suddenly see Princess and Sissy and Lady Mirka as women winning gold in the Olympics. I couldn't find any photos. Too bad. But I found more of these sort of quirks in the data, and I made adjustments to get it to the point where I trusted it again. So my lesson here was, you really need to get a feeling of accuracy and completeness of your data. Missing data can be harder to find than wrong data. And you don't always have to check every value, but think about taking sums and counts and averages and comparing this to plain common sense, can a percentage be higher than 100? Or even better if you can compare it to a different data source. And now looking at a different way of data preparation and how that can be connected to creating more exotic or unique visuals. So the standard bar and line chart are so common that you can create them with whatever tool that lets you do data viz. You simply supply the data, and the visual, the tool itself, does the heavy lifting for you, the visual heavy lifting. But the more that you start to deviate from these standard charts, the more that you'll have to supply other aspects of the data, the visual as well. Like, where on the screen should the data be placed? And it can take a little bit of time to sort of figure out and calculate these things, but it can get you some truly unique results. For example, the Olympic feathers piece is really just a whole lot of rotated and stacked bar charts. And they all follow the same concept, but they also depend on each other. And at the start, I tried to calculate the rotation of all of these different feathers in JavaScript. But after having written 30 lines of code and still not achieving something that I knew I could do in 2 lines in R, which is my favorite data prep and analysis tool. I'm a data scientist from my background, so that's when I just got so frustrated that I took all of these preparations into R as well, even if they were so-called visual variables, by which I mean that they have nothing to do with the data, but only with how it's laid out on the screen. So I pre-calculated the initial rotation that was needed to make sure that these circles would eventually end up at the center, and then how far each of these feathers had to be rotated based on their predecessors. But the only placement variable that I kept calculating in JavaScript to keep it dynamic was the year scale from the center outward. So then I could sort of shrink or expand the circles based on screen size. But even each metal's offset from the center was something I calculated beforehand. So even though they have nothing to do with the data, it's perfectly fine to pre-calculate these things and attach them to your data. And this can be useful for fixed datasets more often than you think, because they can be easier to calculate in whatever tool outside of the tool that you're going to use to eventually visualize your data with, such as JavaScript or Tableau. For those visuals that end up living in the browser, it can also save you a lot of browser calculations, which makes the visual faster to load, especially on mobile. And a personal benefit for me is that it makes for a lot more readable JavaScript file. So Shirley and me have filled many pages of our notebooks with sketches because they help us think and lay out ideas beforehand. And my sketches are actually often very simple, only focusing on the main abstract shape that I want to fit my data into. Colors and layout and details, these are things I only vaguely think about, but don't act on until I have the data on my screen. There's just no use to spend any time on these things until I figure it out that the data will actually work once I've morphed it into that sort of main shape. For the Olympics piece, I was actually inspired by the shape of a peacock feather, placing emphasis on the more recent editions. But I had no idea if that would look all right once I finally placed all 5,000 medals together. So I had to see if that would work before moving on. And it took a few steps, but eventually I had a feeling like, yeah, this could go somewhere. But for networks, it's actually pretty difficult to create a sketch that is more concrete than just circles connected by lines. Because the best visual shape is so inherent into the sort of connections within your data. And for October month, I dove into royalty. I've always been intrigued by how intermarried the royals really are. You know, are they cousins twice removed, 6 times removed, closer, somewhere in between? You know, who is really close? And luckily, I found this genealogy data set online that contained a gigantic family tree of the European royal houses. It was from 1992, so I had to spend one more night on Wikipedia, adding 1 or 2 more generations in the main line of succession. But it was kind of fun to learn about these things. So here is the end result, where the 10 current royal leaders are the big circles, and then everybody is connected to their parents, their partner, and their children. And if you hover over one person, you can see how far 6 degrees of separation reaches into that web. So this Pauline of Württemberg is connected to 6 current royal leaders within 6 generations. But you can also select maybe here the Queen of England and anybody else, like maybe the Prince of Liechtenstein, and see what the shortest path is between these two. So how you get from one side to the other. So this one is pretty far back, but I think Norway, the King of Norway and the Queen of England are pretty closely related, I would say, because this entire web is connected. But when I first started out with this data set, I had no idea what it contained. So I just placed the data on the screen using the most basic network settings, and then this happened. Sort of an explosion of points and lines moving out of my screen. Well, that didn't really work, so I thought, well, okay, let's rein in that gravity just a little bit so it's not moving outside anymore, but then it was just a useless hairball. Well, trying to figure out what to do with this. Well, maybe I can color it by year of birth, which wasn't helping. But thankfully, in a browser, you can have gravity, because these networks, they're often simulated by using gravity and charges. But on a computer, I can have gravity depend on a variable. So I can pull this web apart by year of birth as well. Well, this was better, but it was still a rather uninsightful bundle. And at this point, I'd already invested several hours into playing with the network settings, trying different kinds of connections, and adjusting my data. And I was really ready to just, give up and try a different angle, like how much are the royals spending these days? But I gave it one last try. And that's when I decided to focus on the current royal leaders. So I placed these in a line, and then I let the vertical gravity depend on which of these royal leaders you were most closely related to. And that's when I finally saw it. Insights. For example, that the Queen of England and the King of Norway, I forgot which one actually, are closely related, but that Liechtenstein and Monaco separated from the rest 200 years ago. But it was really only around this time that I started worrying about the more design aspects of the visualization. And these networks, they always remind me of constellations, and with my astronomy background, I have a bias for all things space, so that's why I turned it into a starry night. And I could have never designed this visualization beforehand in Illustrator. I had to go hand in hand with the actual data and apply my design choices to all of the data simultaneously to see if the results were both interesting and insightful. But getting back to actual sketching, during September, I made my most personal visualization ever. Our topic was travel, and I took the opportunity to visualize all of the vacations I've ever been on. So with the help of my parents, sorting through all of my analog childhood photos and browsing through my travel journals, I managed to create a list of all of the vacations I've been on and extra information. And I wanted to keep this month very simple. Just a row for every year that I've been alive, and then colored blocks on the periods where I was on vacation. And then these would sort of be decorated to give an idea of where did I go, who I was with, how much did I enjoy it, these kinds of things. So I drew this sketch around that idea. And the thing is, though, when I looked at this sketch again, I noticed that my mind had glossed over something pretty important. Namely, that I'm only on vacation for a max of 4 to 5 weeks a year, which isn't even 10% of a year. I mean, that's not too bad in general, but in this sketch, it looks more like I'm on vacation for at least a quarter of each year. So I knew if I would create this with the actual data, it would be mostly empty, which wasn't what I had in mind. So I started sketching some more and finally came on this sort of idea where I would squish any month in which I hadn't been on vacation. That would make it pretty darn difficult to compare exact months across the years, but that wasn't my main goal anyway. I really wanted people to see trends in my vacations, like mostly sun-driven during early childhood to culture in my teens and nature these days. And by first sketching it out, I noticed that my initial idea wasn't going to work, and it also guided me towards a new approach. So here is the final result of these 30 years of my vacations, but I have to admit that the favorite part of this month was really just reminiscing with my parents over old photos and things we remembered from those times. And as another example, for the Olympics piece, when I saw that peacock feather, I started drawing some feather shapes, and I filled them completely with color. And again, during sketching, I started, wait a minute, sports, they have different events. And the events, they change during the edition. So how would that actually work? So I already have some sort of question marks in there that I'm like, this isn't quite going to work. And then the next day, I tried to explain my idea to a friend, again, sketching out parts of it. And again, while trying to explain it to him, I stumbled upon logical thinking errors that my mind was just glossing over. So only by drawing out the shape several times, figuring out my thinking errors and drawing a new shape, did I get to a final design that seemed to work. So instead of going straight from your data or an idea in your head to the computer, draw out your design on plain paper first. It's the ideal way to quickly catch thinking errors. And you don't have to be some sort of artist to create data viz designs. I mean, they're mostly circles and rectangles and simple curves anyway. It's just that if you cannot make it work logically on paper, it is definitely not going to work on a computer with the real data. And another thing I tried to investigate while sketching is how to add extra details, how to create more context around the main insight that I want to convey. So even though the Olympics piece is already quite data dense, I couldn't resist adding information about the Olympic and world records, because every athlete there tries to break at least the first, if not the latter. So I added a small white dot on a medal if that resulted in a record, such as here for Usain Bolt's 200-meter dash in Beijing. And a way for me to think about adding these extra details is to think about the visual channels that are still free after I have my main chart standing. Let me explain that a bit more with another example. So for the past 19 years, during exactly 1 week in the year, I think more than half of the Netherlands listens to the same radio station. I mean, we're a small country, but that's still pretty unique. But this happens during the final week of the year, when the top 2,000 best songs ever are aired, counting down to the new year. And it's quite a thing for a Dutch person, so I asked Shirley if our topic for December could be music, so I could tackle these 2,000 songs. And my goal was to visualize what decade was most successful in terms of these song release years. So here we have the base visual, where each song is a circle, and they're clustered to sit at the year of release, from the 60s until today. And yeah, we can sort of see that, oh wait, let me explain that a bit more. We have the size, so the bigger the size, the higher the position in the top 2,000, and the darker the color, the higher the position in the weekly top 40s it ever reached, which was a data set I had to scrape separately. And then we can see that the 70s and 80s are quite popular still, and that people are trying to forget the early zeros, but it's getting better now. But I felt that this data set contained so much more interesting information that could supply context. I mean, we had artist name and band name and who knows what. But I also felt that the current visual was just a little bit too boring for my taste. So I started thinking about what visual channels are still free. Well, here I could have a stroke, or I could add an extra mark on top. I could do something with textual annotations, and then probably even more. So this new sketch was made that sort of explored these ideas. And in 2016, sadly, Prince and David Bowie died, so I really wanted to highlight all of their songs and explain with some text to sort of say how that had changed with respect to the list of the last year. But I could also use the list ranking in different ways. For example, to highlight the most popular band, or to show where the most popular song from 2016 was, which one was the highest riser or newcomer, and to single out that Pokemon song. Or even just to highlight the top 10 songs more clearly by adding an extra mark on top. And I felt that by adding these extra bits of information, the visual could be more fully understood and enjoyed, and it made for a visually more interesting piece as well. So even though your visualization is making the main point clear to your audience, think about adding extra details. To use remaining visual channels to add other variables that can supply more context for the truly interested reader. So as expected, most of our hours are filled with actually getting the data on the screen. And here are some of my perhaps less obvious coding lessons. So for the very first month, the topic was movies. And it was pretty clear to me I wanted to do something with The Lord of the Rings, which is my favorite trilogy. And I thought that with the popularity of the movies, that there would be loads of data available online, which didn't turn out to be true at all. But I did find one real gem of a data set. So someone had created a set that contained the number of words spoken by each character in each scene of all 3 extended editions of The Lord of the Rings. I mean, how amazing is that? I knew I had to visualize that data. And I decided to focus on how many words has each member of the fellowship spoken at the different locations. But as you may be able to read from the screenshot of the data on the left, there's no location information in there. So with the help of the scripts found online and my own memory of having seen the movies way too often, I just manually added location information to all of the 800 rows of fellowship data. A little dedication can go a long way. So I made sketches, and I quickly came upon one where the members of the fellowship would be in the center, and then the locations would be spread around them in a circle. And then these strings would connect it to where the thickness of a string is the number of words spoken by that character at that location. The only problem was that I didn't know any tool that could create this visualization for me. But it reminded me of a chart that did exist, which is called a chord diagram. So I thought, well, maybe I can sort of try and form or change that chord diagram to look as my sketch. So here we have a basic stripped of all text chord diagram. And the most fundamental thing to me was to see if I could somehow make these chords flow towards the center instead, which eventually took less time than anticipated, which is pretty rare for me in coding, but I was quite happy with that. Getting rid of the extra empty spaces, it was ready for the actual Lord of the Rings data and some more appropriate colors. Well, we have 9 members of the fellowship, so this center part had to sort of break apart for these members, but this was just getting way too squished. So, well, I could just pull the 2 halves apart, that's fine. But now these strings were looking pretty odd, especially in the top and bottom. And that's when I finally took it upon me to learn how to write my own SVG paths, scalable vector graphics. Because D3, the tool that I use most to create my visualizations with, it usually creates SVGs. And I'd never actually learned how that truly works. So this time I finally dove into that, which was the thing that took the longest in this project, figuring out how to make these strings look more natural. But that is how I sort of ended up with this new chart that was mutated from D3's chord diagram. And because we have a lot of these chords visible here, I thought I could use some simple interaction to create some focus. So if you hover over a location, you see the people that spoke there. And if you hover over a person, you see the places and how much he spoke. But I also added like a small piece of text below that shows a little bit of information or insight that I'd found from this data set. And I always have to share this one. Boromir, who is really only alive during 1 movie, he still manages to speak more than Legolas does in 3. I didn't know that. It kind of makes sense. And I also don't really want to say how long it took me to get the Elvish translations for these locations. I still don't know if they're correct. I hope they're. Looks nice. So many people have done great things and that they share online or some sort of way to recreate it. So even if you think you are creating something new, you don't always have to start from scratch. Pick the thing that most closely resembles your design and start adjusting that. Remix what's out there already. And there's actually nothing more that I learned about than creating these custom SVG paths and how they are connected to so many more possibilities to shape my visuals. From simple curves instead of straight lines in my royalty network, to sweeping arcs in my visualization about fantasy books, to the feather shapes that I really truly created for the Olympic Feathers project, but that never made it to the final version. The Lord of the Rings that started all these strings, And I don't even know what to call them, radially flowing lines between two groups of circles that I recently created for Cardcaptor Sakura Viz. And another visualization that is heavily revolved around any other Cardcaptor Sakura fans? I can't see. I hope there was at least one. Another visualization that revolves heavily around custom SVG paths has to do with our Nostalgia Month, in which I dove into Dragon Ball Z. I was a big fan of that during my teens. Well, for those that sadly don't know what it is, Dragon Ball Z is an anime that revolves around fighting. So it seemed quite fitting to me to create a visualization that would highlight all of the fights that occurred during all of the episodes. You know, kind of showing who fought whom, and was there anything special about the fight? You know, what state were they in, Super Saiyan or some other transformed state, and if there was anything special about these fights. And here we sort of have the base visual with the first fight at the top, and then going down. And from left to right are the different sagas, which is sort of similar to story arcs or seasons in a way. And to more easily follow a character from fight to fight, I wanted to sort of connect all of their fights by a line. And I started out with a collection of so-called quadratic Bezier curves, which give you the option to pull on lines by moving these so-called anchor points. And to make it visually a little more interesting, I pulled harder when the distance between two fights was farther apart. And then I got some great advice to use the side of a fight to denote good guys or bad guys. So swooshing on the right side is a bad guy, on the left side is a good guy. Which shows you that for this character, Vegeta, he started out as a bad guy, moved around a bit, and then mostly became one of the good guys. And then introducing the other characters. And this already gave me insights into Dragon Ball Z that I never realized before, so I was quite happy with that. But I just wasn't liking these single thickness lines, because they just didn't convey the dynamic nature of these fights. So instead, I wanted to create a shape that I could fill with a color, which would mimic a stroke of varying thickness. So as usual, I went to plain paper and drew out my desired end state and deconstructed that in terms of typically mathematical, but here SVG path elements, which really only came down to flipping the path back up again using different amounts of swoosh. I hope that makes sense, right? Swoosh. And using that sort of small change now made the lines connecting these fighters between their fights a lot more visually interesting, I found. So even though I've been talking about SVGs here because they are so integral to my work, in general the lesson is that you should really thoroughly try and understand the advanced functionalities of your preferred tool if you want to go beyond the standard examples. I'd been using D3 for 2 or 3 years before I finally learned how D3 creates these SVGs. And it opened up such a world for me in terms of creativity and possibility that I wish I'd done that sooner. Well, another thing that Shirley and me had a lot of fun with during the year was math. And here is my addition to our collaboration month with Google News Lab. And as a non-native English speaker, I was very interested to learn about translations. So this page shows you like what do other languages want to have translated into English using Google Translate. From the most translated word overall to like the top 10 of each of these languages. It's always a bit slower when I put it into my presentation. To finally sort of the similarities between these languages. And for that first visual, I actually wanted to string together these most common translated words for these languages by a string of words that would represent the top 100 most translated words overall. And preferably, I wanted it to be very organic looking like this. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to mathematically create a similarly organic shape that would update and be responsive to both desktop and mobile sizes. So eventually, I went with the idea of sort of beads on a string slowly zigzagging down. But yeah, typically I make errors in my math that reveal themselves once I code it out. But thankfully, I figured out my issue. And now I could update this layout to either be 4 or 3 or 2 beats wide, depending on the screen width. And another visualization that was quite an interesting logic and math puzzle to solve was the last visual on the page that showed similarities between languages. So if two languages have a word in common, they are connected in their top 10, they are connected by a line. But initially, I wanted to have all of these visualizations made up completely out of words. So I wanted to sort of replace these lines by the words themselves. But I should have known this. But when I finally got that working, it was one complete mess. I should have sketched it out more first. So I had to compromise, and therefore ended up only placing these words on the lines connected towards the center. But that made it quite important that I would place these words in the most upright manner possible for readability. But that gave quite some convoluted calculations in terms of the text paths on which these words are drawn, which became glaringly obvious when you finally click one of these languages to make it move towards the center, which I don't think is quite what a user expects would happen when they click. So this is where math and rational problem solving came to the rescue. It took a few more pages from my notebook before I finally figured out how to solve it. I have a small notebook. But now it's thankfully working the way I think a user might expect it to work. And what I'm doing is really more of a hack, because when you click one of these languages, the words, they fade out, and then I immediately replace all of these lines by their final state, but reverse engineer to look like the initial one, and then smoothly transitioning them to the final one. So the lesson here is very simple. Learn to love math, and especially geometry. I am not kidding you, because it is typically the best way to solve these visual problems. So I want to end with one of my favorite lessons, and this one is about our February topic, which was nature. And I always wanted to do something that was more along the lines of data or generative art, and I felt that the apparent randomness of nature was quite a good match, and it also reminded me of butterflies, how their path also feels kind of random to me. So I wanted to sort of mimic these butterfly-like paths across my screen, where the paths themselves would be guided by butterfly data. So the main color of the species would sort of represent the color on the screen. The line type was the species, and then the wingspan would define the width. And then using lots of semi-random number generators and inspiration by the works of Jared Tarble and Inconvergent, did I let my butterflies free across the screen. And this is the only month in which I make no attempt to make the data insightful. I just wanted to make something that was based on data, but that sort of delights its audience, that keeps them mesmerized as the screen fills up with more and more butterfly paths. And keeping your audience engaged and delighted is a very powerful way to keep people into a more complex visualization. And it can be done in quite subtle and diverse ways. For example, on a flight back to Amsterdam, I was without Wi-Fi, so I couldn't really do anything essential. So I just made an animated legend about my visualization about fantasy books. And other non-essential things that I've added to visualizations are, animated GIFs of the most memorable moments of Dragon Ball Z, or having a hover in my music visualization for people that really want to know what that circle was, or making these top 10 songs look like tiny vinyls, or having these annotations of weird and silly events that happened during the Olympic Games, such as Henry Pierce having to stop for ducks in the rowing event, but still managing to win gold. That would be fun if that happened these days. But it's just that, even though, getting the data on your screen in such a manner as to make it insightful is key, it's the other things to add, such as animations and annotations, weird legends, GIFs, and more, that can make it truly unique and special and even more of a delight to investigate. So take the time to think about these things as well. And a final important aspect of doing a collaboration, and maybe even the best aspect, is that you're not in it alone. So Shirley and me, even though we made our visualizations separately, we shared our results throughout the project. From sharing in the joy, to finding an appropriate data set, to discussing ideas, to sharing loads of screenshots to ask for feedback. And we started out as two people who sort of knew each other and had a good time during a conference, but we ended up having this incredible friendship these days. We talk to each other almost daily now, and we work with each other on a professional level for clients that are too big for just the one of us. So we've been working together on clients for maybe half a year now. So I can definitely advise you to also start together if you want to embark on a more advanced project, because it helps you keep going more. You feel that responsibility. You want someone that is responsible, though, so that you don't both slack off. And someone that you respect, very helpful, and that you trust, that you can learn to trust, because that is crucial in giving and providing feedback. And as a warning, at some point it will get hard, and it will require a level of dedication. But keep on going on another day if you're having a bad day, because with each small thing that you create, you'll learn something new that you can then develop further on your next project. So that's also why I think these personal small projects, or bigger ones, can be truly so important to just general your career. So even though I have 3 more seconds left, Shirley also made visualizations each month, so let me really breeze through some of my favorites from her, the 2 favorites. This one is about films. So it took the movie blockbusters from every year that she's been alive, and then turned them into flowers, which I think is an amazing project. It's very artful. She made also an amazing project about Hamilton. She's crazy about Hamilton, so you should definitely read the write-up of this month to get a sense of the data gathering alone. This should actually be a movie. Yeah, she goes through all of the lines in Hamilton. It's quite a delight just to go through this. Well, that's odd. Right, to round it off. During this year, I found, you can find data in the weirdest places, and that, it's not blasphemy to pre-calculate visual variables, but that you can also sketch to help weed out thinking errors, and even sketch with code. And math is amazing, but I knew that already though, but I hope you do now too. And that surprisingly small things can sort of create a sense of delight to your audience. And we didn't set out to learn or be confronted by these things. We just wanted to have fun and experiment, and in that we definitely succeeded. But even though the year has already come and gone, we still have a month or 2 left to go. There's still a few empty spots here. I still have to do 1, Shirley has to finish 3. So it's, I meant that in a good way. But the thing is that we were definitely having fun, but especially when we both started freelancing, it was just too much to keep this schedule going as well, so we took things a little bit more slowly, but we're definitely going to finish. But yeah, so most of these things that you saw, a lot of them you can find on my website, Visual Cinnamon, because whoever can spell my name correctly, so I had to use something else. Data visualization lives on Twitter, so come join me there if you want to stay up to date. You can find the presentation right over there. I brought DataVis stickers for some that might want to come ask me, and finally, thank you very much for your attention.
That was fantastic.